The first thing I want you to understand is that I did not wake up one morning and decide to become the person who shut down an entire neighborhood's only road to school. I was not looking for a fight. I was not trying to prove a point. And honestly, at 61 years old, I had already spent enough years teaching middle school kids to know that arguing with people rarely solves anything. But when a group of strangers moved into my town, looked at my property, and decided they could push me around because they had a bigger budget and a nicer logo on their letterhead, they made one mistake. They forgot that quiet people can still have boundaries. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and for 32 years I taught history at Brookfield Middle School in a small town called Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania. I spent most of my life teaching teenagers about rights, responsibility, and standing up when something was wrong, but I never imagined I would have to practice those lessons on my own front porch. I bought my little corner property back in 2003, long before anyone had heard of luxury developments or homeowners associations in that part of town. Back then, my street was mostly gravel. The fields behind my house stretched for miles, and the only sounds I heard in the morning were birds, wind through the trees, and the old coffee maker rattling in my kitchen. My favorite part of the property was not the house itself. It was the small patch of land beside it where I planted tomatoes, rosemary, and wildflowers. There was an old wooden bench underneath a maple tree where I would sit after work, grade papers, and watch the sunset. That little corner was not just land to me. It was 30 years of memories. Then in 2019, everything changed. A development company came in and purchased the farmland across from me. Within months, the quiet fields disappeared behind construction fences. Trucks rolled in every morning. Workers poured foundations, and suddenly a neighborhood of 180 townhomes started rising where there used to be nothing but open sky. I understood progress. I really did. People needed homes. Families were moving in, and the town was growing. I was not one of those people who hated change. But what bothered me was the attitude that came with it. The new homeowners association appeared almost overnight, and with it came a new president named Victoria Langford. Victoria was the kind of person who walked into a room like she already owned it. She was always perfectly dressed, always carrying a folder full of rules, and always speaking with that polite smile people use when they are actually telling you what they expect you to do. At first, I tried to be friendly. I introduced myself, welcomed the new neighbors, and even brought cookies to the first community meeting. I thought we could all live peacefully. But within a few months, small complaints started showing up. My mailbox was apparently not the right style. My garden was considered too unstructured. My fence, the same wooden fence that had stood there for 16 years, suddenly became a problem. I ignored the first few comments because I thought, honestly, this was just someone being overly strict. Then one morning, I found an envelope attached to my gate. It was not a conversation. It was not a request. It was an official notice from the Cedar Hollow Ridge HOA. The letter said my fence violated community appearance standards and needed to be moved back 8 feet from the property line. 8 feet may not sound like much until it is your 8 feet. That space held my vegetable garden, my flower beds, and the bench where I spent countless evenings after long days teaching. I stood there holding that letter, looking at my yard, and I remember thinking, how did we get here? I had never bothered anyone. I had never caused trouble. But now someone who had lived there less than a year was telling me that a piece of my own property needed to disappear because it did not match their vision. My first reaction was anger, but after 30 years in a classroom, I learned something important. Emotions make noise, but paperwork speaks louder. So instead of yelling, instead of calling Victoria and giving her a piece of my mind, I went inside, opened an old filing cabinet, and started searching through documents I had almost forgotten about. That was when I found the original property deed from when I bought the house. And buried inside those pages was something I never expected to find. Something that would completely change the balance of power between me and the HOA. I still remember sitting at my kitchen table that night with the deed spread out in front of me, a cup of coffee getting cold beside my hand, and a strange feeling coming over me. It was not anger anymore. It was clarity. The document showed something the HOA apparently never bothered to check. The small access road running along the edge of my property was not a public road, and it was not owned by the development company. It was a private access lane that belonged to my property, with specific language giving me control over its use. For years, I'd allowed people to drive through because I believed neighbors helped neighbors. That was how I was raised. You do not make life harder for people just because you can. But reading those words on that piece of paper made me realize something important. Kindness and permission are not the same thing. I called a local property attorney named Daniel Brooks, a man who had handled land disputes in our county for over 20 years. I expected him to tell me I was misunderstanding something. Instead, he quietly read the deed, looked through the survey documents, and leaned back in his chair. "Eleanor," he said, "do you realize they've been using your private access road without a formal agreement?" I told him I knew they used it, but I assumed the town or the developer had taken care of whatever paperwork was needed. He shook his head. "Assumptions are exactly how these situations happen." That sentence stayed with me, because that was the real problem. Everyone assumed I would always say yes. The HOA assumed because they had a board, a lawyer, and hundreds of residents behind them, I would just step aside. They assumed the quiet retired teacher would not push back, and maybe 6 months earlier, they would have been right. But after that fence letter, something changed. It was not about the fence anymore. It was about respect. I gave Victoria one more chance to handle things like neighbors instead of opponents. I requested a meeting. I wanted to sit down, talk calmly, and find a solution. I even suggested a compromise. Maybe we could discuss landscaping. Maybe find a way to keep everyone happy. But Victoria arrived with 2 HOA board members and a stack of papers. She did not come to negotiate. She came expecting me to surrender. She placed the documents on my kitchen table and said, "Eleanor, this community has standards. Everyone follows them." I looked at her and asked, "Does everyone include the HOA?" She frowned. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" I smiled slightly and said, "It means you are asking me to respect rules while ignoring property rights." The room became quiet. One of the board members looked uncomfortable. Victoria did not. She leaned forward and said, "You need to understand that this neighborhood depends on cooperation." And that was the moment I knew she understood exactly what she was doing. She was not asking for cooperation. She was using the word as a softer way to describe control. "I have been cooperative," I told her, "for years. But cooperation requires both sides respecting each other." She stood up, collected her papers, and said the HOA would take further action if the fence was not moved. I watched them leave, and for the first time, I realized this was no longer about convincing them. It was about protecting myself. 2 days later, I prepared a formal notice. It was simple, professional, and completely legal. The notice explained that continued use of the private access road required a formal agreement between the property owner and the HOA. Without one, access would be suspended. I posted it at the entrance gate early Monday morning. I remember the feeling when I locked that gate. It was strange. Part of me felt guilty because I knew families depended on that road. Children used it every morning to get to school. Parents used it to get to work. But another part of me knew something else. If I allowed people to ignore my rights whenever it was convenient, then those rights were meaningless. By 7:15 that morning, the first school bus arrived. The driver stopped, got out, and looked at the notice. He called dispatch. Within an hour, the entire neighborhood knew. The HLA emergency group chat exploded. Parents were furious. Some thought the HOA had handled everything. Others were angry that no one had checked the property records before making demands. Victoria immediately called me. Her voice was calm at first, the kind of calm people use when they think they still have control. "Eleanor, this needs to end today." I looked out my window at the locked gate and said, "I agree. It should have ended before anyone decided my property was theirs." She accused me of punishing innocent families. I told her I understood their frustration. But I was not the person who created the problem. "You built a neighborhood around a road you did not own," I said. "That was never my decision." The next few days were chaotic. Parents missed work trying to arrange transportation. The school district temporarily changed the bus route. Everyone wanted answers. But the interesting thing was that the more people looked into it, the clearer the truth became. The town clerk confirmed the deed records. The county records matched my documents. There was no hidden agreement, no easement, no legal permission. The road everyone depended on belonged to me. Victoria went from being the person with all the answers to the person who suddenly had none. But instead of admitting she made a mistake, she doubled down. The HOA attorney sent letters claiming they would take legal action. They threatened court. They threatened consequences. They wanted me to feel intimidated. But after spending decades teaching teenagers how to research, question information, and think critically, I was not exactly the easiest person to scare with a letter. I saved every email. I documented every conversation. I kept every piece of paper. Then on Friday afternoon, Victoria showed up at my gate herself. She stepped out of her luxury SUV wearing sunglasses, carrying that same confident expression she always had. She walked up to the fence and said, "This has gone far enough." I looked at her and asked, "Has it?" She told me hundreds of people were being affected because of my decision. I nodded and said, "Hundreds of people are being affected because nobody bothered to ask permission before using my property." That was when she finally dropped the polite act. "You are being incredibly difficult," she said. I looked at the fence she wanted me to move and then back at her. "No, Victoria. I am finally being clear." She demanded I reopen the road immediately. Instead, I handed her a folder. Inside was my proposal. If the HOA wanted access, they needed an agreement, a real agreement. Not assumptions, not pressure, not threats. The folder included maintenance costs, liability requirements, and a monthly access fee. She opened it, glanced through the pages, and laughed. "You cannot be serious." I simply said, "I am." She shook her head and called me petty. But as she walked back to her car, I noticed something different. The confidence was gone. Because, for the first time, she realized this was not a fight between a powerful HOA and one homeowner. This was a situation where the facts were finally catching up with her. The Monday morning after Victoria arrived at my gate with her demands, I expected another round of pressure, another letter, maybe another warning from the HOA office. But something different happened. Instead of Victoria showing up with confidence in a stack of rules, she arrived with their attorney. And, honestly, the moment I saw that, I knew the situation had changed. People who are completely certain they are right usually do not need a lawyer to explain why they are right. They simply stand by their position. But when someone suddenly needs legal help to defend a decision, it usually means they have started looking for a way out. The attorney walked slowly toward the gate, looked at the notice, then looked back at Victoria. He spent several minutes reading through the documents I had provided, and I watched from my porch as his expression became more serious. There was no arguing, no dramatic speech, no accusation that I was being unreasonable, just silence. Then he turned to Victoria and asked a question I will never forget. "Did the HOA ever actually get a recorded access agreement?" Victoria hesitated. That pause said more than any answer could have. The attorney looked through the paperwork again, checked the county records, and finally explained the reality to her. The road was not theirs. The access was not guaranteed, and the fence issue they started this entire battle over was not nearly as simple as they had made it sound. For months, Victoria had acted like she was enforcing rules. But now everyone could see she had been trying to create authority where she did not have any. A few days later, I received another call. This time, Victoria's voice was different. I had heard that same confident tone many times before. The tone of someone who believed every conversation was a negotiation they had already won. But this time, there was hesitation, there was frustration, there was something else too. Maybe embarrassment. "Eleanor, we need to talk about an agreement," she said. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, looking out at the same yard she wanted me to change, and thinking about how different this conversation sounded from the one we had weeks earlier. The woman who once told me I had to move my fence was now asking for permission to use my road. We scheduled a meeting with the HOA board, and for the first time since this started, everyone came into the room without the attitude that one side had already won. The conversation was not easy. There were still disagreements. Some board members thought I had gone too far. Others admitted they were never told the full details by Victoria. One homeowner stood up and said something that stuck with me. He said, "I think we all assumed someone else had checked the paperwork." And that was exactly the problem. Everyone assumed. The developer assumed the road would always be available. The HOA assumed I would never challenge them. The neighbors assumed the rules they were given were actually valid. But assumptions are dangerous when they involve someone else's property. In the end, we created an agreement that protected everyone involved. The HOA signed a 15-year access contract. They paid an upfront settlement, agreed to monthly maintenance responsibilities, covered liability insurance, repaired the damaged sections of pavement, and handled the drainage issues that had been building up for years. They also agreed that any future changes involving my property line or the road would require my written approval. And yes, the biggest condition of all, my fence stayed exactly where it was. No 8-foot adjustment, no redesign, no compromise. The fence that caused all of this remained standing. almost like a quiet reminder that they picked the wrong battle. But the truth is, the money and the agreement were never the part that mattered most to me. What mattered was that I did not have to give up something important just because someone louder told me I should. Growing up, my parents always taught me that being kind does not mean being powerless. You can help people. You can be generous. You can be a good neighbor. But you still have the right to say no when someone crosses a line. When the road reopened, I stood outside that morning and watched the school bus come through again. The kids inside were laughing, waving, and completely unaware of the adult drama that had happened behind the scenes. One little boy even waved at me through the window, and I waved back. That moment meant more to me than winning any argument, because I never wanted those families to struggle. I never wanted children to miss school. I never wanted parents to rearrange their lives. I just wanted the people responsible to recognize that they had made a mistake and fix it the right way. After everything settled down, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had criticized me during the first few days started coming by to talk. Some apologized. Some admitted they had only heard Victoria's side of the story. One woman told me, "I thought you were angry at the neighborhood." I told her, I was never angry at the neighbors. I was angry that nobody bothered to ask. And that difference matters. A few months later, the HOA held its annual election. Victoria believed the controversy would disappear with time. She thought people would forget. But people remembered. They remembered the emergency meetings. They remembered the confusion. They remembered being told there was no problem when there clearly was one. When the votes were counted, Victoria lost her position by a wide margin. 37 homeowners voted for change, and only 10 voted to keep things the same. The woman who once believed control came from a title learned that leadership actually comes from trust. Today, my life is pretty simple. I still wake up early. I still drink coffee on the porch. I still plant tomatoes every spring. My fence is still there. My maple tree still provides shade, and the road that caused all this trouble is now properly maintained by the people who use it. Looking back, I do not think this story was really about a fence or a road. Those were just the things everyone could see. The real issue was about respect. It was about what happens when someone believes having more people, more money, or more authority means they can ignore one person standing in front of them. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is not the easiest person to defeat. Sometimes they are just waiting for the right moment to speak. And I know people will have different opinions about what I did. Some will say I should have been more understanding. Some will say Victoria got exactly what she deserved. Maybe both sides have a point, but I want to know what you think. If someone tried to force you to change your property after ignoring your rights, would you stand your ground like I did, or would you try to find another way? Was closing the road the right move, or did it create too much trouble for innocent people? Share your honest opinion in the comments because I want to hear both sides of the argument. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people finding the courage to stand up when they are pushed too far, make sure to subscribe, because the next story might remind you that sometimes justice does not come from being the loudest person in the room. It comes from knowing exactly where you stand.